She had rehearsed on the long coach ride from Dorset exactly what she would do if she ever saw him again. She would not flinch. She would not weep. She would look at him the way one looks at old weather, something that had once done damage, now simply passed. What she had not rehearsed was this: standing in the entrance hall of Grey Hollow Park, her travelling bag still in her hand, her references still folded in her coat pocket, and finding that the man who had walked away from her 7 years ago was not a memory at all. He was standing at the top of the staircase, tall, still, wearing authority the way other men wear coats, as though it had been fitted for him at birth and altered nothing since. His dark eyes moved across the entrance hall with the unhurried efficiency of a man accustomed to assessing everything in a room before committing to any of it. They landed on her. Nora Fenn did not flinch. She had promised herself that much, but the recognition, when it came, that single fractional pause, the almost imperceptible arrest of his gaze, hit her somewhere beneath the rib-cage with the precision of a blade that had been sharpened specifically for this moment. He did not know her. She watched the pause pass, watched his expression settle back into its cool, composed arrangement, watched him begin to descend the stairs with the measured tread of a man who had looked at her face and found it unremarkable. 7 years, and she was unremarkable. Nora's grip tightened on the handle of her bag. She had come here for the position. She needed the wages. She had told herself firmly and repeatedly on the road from Dorset that she was in no danger because a man could not wound you twice with the same weapon. She was beginning to suspect she had been wrong about that. Grey Hollow Park sat at the edge of the North Yorkshire moors like a house that had decided long ago to stop apologizing for itself. Its stone was the color of old pewter. Its corridors were long and cold, and hung with portraits of men who all shared the same jaw, strong, unsmiling, built for consequence rather than warmth. The Duke of Wrentham had inherited all of it at 23, along with the title, the debts of the previous generation, and a reputation that had spent the subsequent decade rearranging itself from reckless to formidable. He had done it through sheer will and a capacity for silence that most men mistook for indifference. Those who knew him better, a very small number, understood it for what it was: the self-discipline of a man who had learned, at considerable cost, that feeling things openly was an invitation for the world to use those feelings against him. His daughter, Lady Maisie, was 5 years old and had not spoken in 4 months, not since her mother died. The physicians called it grief. The housemaids called it a haunting. The Duke called it the one problem in his considerable life that money and authority had entirely failed to solve. He had advertised for a nanny with patience and experience and a firm, gentle hand. He had not advertised for Nora Fenn. Nora was 26, the daughter of a Dorset vicar, and possessed of the particular steadiness that comes not from an easy life, but from surviving a difficult one without allowing it to make her cruel. She had loved once with the whole and unguarded entirety of her heart. She had paid for it in the currency of 7 years' silence, and one secret she had carried so long it had become indistinguishable from the weight of herself. She had taken this position because she was practical, and because she needed the money. She had not known who the Duke of Wrentham was until she was already through the door. The child was sitting in the middle of the nursery floor when Nora entered, surrounded by an untouched breakfast tray and a collection of wooden animals arranged in a precise, solitary circle. She did not look up. Lady Maisie Carew was small for 5, with her father's dark coloring and a stillness about her that was not the stillness of peace, but of something folded very carefully inward, the way a person folds a letter they do not wish anyone else to read. Nora set down her bag. She did not crouch. She did not announce herself with the bright, effortful cheerfulness she had witnessed other women deploy around grieving children like a kind of assault. She simply sat on the floor at a respectful distance and looked at the wooden animals. A lion, a horse, a small painted elephant with one ear chipped off. After a long moment, she picked up the elephant, examined it seriously, set it back down facing a different direction. Maisie's eyes moved just briefly to the elephant, then back to her lap. It was not much. It was enough. The housekeeper, Mrs. Alcott, a brisk woman with a kind face she kept under strict administrative control, had delivered Nora's instructions that morning without once mentioning the Duke. His Grace rose at 6. His Grace dined alone. His Grace did not require the nanny's presence at any point during the day, and would send word if he wished to discuss the child's progress. Nora had found this satisfactory in every possible respect. She was here for Maisie. She would focus on Maisie. She would collect her wages at the end of each month, and she would not think about the man 2 floors below her, sitting in his study, going about the business of being a duke, entirely unaware that the woman he had once promised his whole heart to was now sleeping under his roof. She would absolutely not think about that. She thought about it constantly. Not in the way she had feared, not with the old tenderness, the warmth she had spent 7 years carefully extinguishing. What occupied her mind as she moved through Grey Hollow's corridors was something colder and more clarifying. Curiosity, perhaps, the need to understand a thing she had never been given the language for. He had left without a word. One morning he had been there, earnest and certain in the way of young men who have not yet learned that certainty is a luxury, and the next he was simply gone. No letter, no message, only the housemaid's whisper 3 days later that the young lord had returned to London and was expected to announce his engagement to the Earl of Fenwick's daughter before the season was out. Nora had waited a week, then walked home to her father's house and never spoken of it again. The engagement had not happened. She had learned this much from the newspapers in the years following. The Duke of Wrentham had married eventually, a quiet match to a Northumberland lady who had died of fever when their daughter was 14 months old. Beyond that, Nora knew nothing. She had made a discipline of knowing nothing. She was reconsidering the wisdom of that discipline now. On the 3rd morning, she encountered him in the corridor outside the nursery. He was heading toward the stairs. She was carrying Maisie's breakfast tray. They met at the corner where the corridor narrowed, and for 3 full seconds there was no sound in Grey Hollow Park except the distant movement of the moor's wind against the windows. "Miss Fenn," he said. A nod, precise, courteous, utterly impersonal. "Your Grace," she replied. He moved past her. She continued to the nursery. She set the tray down on the table, sat in the chair beside the window, and looked out at the grey-green moors for considerably longer than was strictly necessary. Maisie spoke on the 5th day. Not to Nora, not yet. She spoke to the chipped elephant in a voice so small and private it was barely a breath, and what she said was a single word that Nora did not catch. But her lips had moved, her eyes had been bright for a moment with something that was not grief. Nora told no one. It felt like something that belonged to the child alone, a door opened a fraction of an inch, not yet an invitation to enter. What she did tell Mrs. Alcott was that Maisie had eaten a full breakfast for the first time and had allowed Nora to brush her hair without pulling away. Mrs. Alcott received this information with visible relief and the closest thing to warmth her administrative bearing allowed. "His Grace will want to know," she said. "Then please tell him," Nora said pleasantly. "That is your prerogative, Mrs. Alcott, not mine." She had no wish to report to him, no wish to stand in his study while he sat behind his desk and looked at her with that expression of polite, impersonal assessment, the expression of a man who had looked at her face and filed it under staff, competent, unremarkable. She found to her considerable irritation that being unremarkable to him was its own specific variety of pain. She had not expected that. She had thought herself past it. She was in the library that evening selecting a picture book for Maisie's bedtime when she heard the door open behind her. She knew before she turned. The quality of his silence was distinctive, inhabited, deliberate, the silence of a man who occupied space differently from everyone else in the house. "Miss Alcott tells me the child ate this morning," he said. "She did," Nora said, without turning. "She has a preference for the soft bread over the toast. I thought it worth noting." A pause. "You did not come to tell me yourself."
"No," she agreed. "I did not." The silence stretched, then footsteps. He had gone. Nora stared at the spine of the picture book in her hand and told her heartbeat firmly to behave itself. He summoned her to his study on the 8th day. Not urgently, a note delivered via Mrs. Alcott requesting Miss Fenn's attendance at her earliest convenience. The phrasing was so meticulously correct that Nora suspected he had written it twice. The study was exactly as she might have imagined. Books floor to ceiling, a desk the size of a small country, a fire burning with the contained efficiency of everything else in his life. He was standing when she entered, which surprised her. Men like him did not generally stand for women like her. "Sit down, Miss Fenn." "I am comfortable standing, Your Grace." He looked at her, a measuring look, not unkind, but thorough. "You are the third nanny this household has employed in 4 months. The previous 2 lasted 11 days and 16 days, respectively. I would prefer not to repeat the exercise." "Then I would suggest," Nora said carefully, "not making this conversation discouraging." Something moved across his face, gone before she could read it. "How is she?" he asked, and the shift in his voice from the formal register of a duke conducting business to something quieter, less defended, was so abrupt that Nora required a moment to adjust to it. "She is making progress, slowly, on her own terms. I would not attempt to rush her." The physician recommended structured routines. "The physician," Nora said evenly, "has not sat on the nursery floor for 3 hours watching her arrange wooden animals. Children grieve differently from adults, Your Grace. She does not need structure as much as she needs someone who will simply stay." The silence that followed was a different quality from the others she had collected in this house. He was not dismissing what she had said. He was sitting with it. "You may go, Miss Fenn," he said at last. She went. She did not allow herself to notice until she was safely back in the corridor that his eyes had followed her all the way to the door. Maisie said her name on the 12th day. Not out loud, she wrote it, or rather she drew it in careful, crooked letters on the fogged window pane of the nursery. Nora. Nora stared at it for a long moment. Then she wrote her own name on the pane beside it, in the same crooked letters, deliberately imperfect. Maisie looked at both names.
Then, with one small finger, she drew a line connecting them. Nora did not weep. She had made herself a rule about weeping at Grey Hollow. It was the sort of thing, once started, that might not stop. But her throat tightened in a way that required several seconds of concentrated attention to manage. She was in the garden with Maisie that afternoon. The child had consented to outdoor air for the first time, on the condition that she could bring the chipped elephant, when she heard boots on the gravel path behind them. The Duke had not been in the garden since she arrived. She knew this because she had quietly made a point of knowing his general movements, the way one keeps track of weather on an uncertain coast. He stopped a few feet away. He was looking at his daughter with an expression Nora had not yet seen on him, all his careful composure temporarily absent, replaced by something raw and helpless that he had clearly not intended her to witness. Maisie had not yet noticed him. She was walking the chipped elephant along the top of the low garden wall, making no sound, but moving her lips as though narrating something only she could hear. "She is talking to herself," Nora said quietly. "She has been for 2 days." The Duke said nothing. His jaw was set in the way of a man using every available resource to hold his expression still. "She is coming back," Nora said. "Slowly, but she is coming back." He looked at her then, and for one unguarded moment, before the composure returned, his eyes said everything his voice could not. He began to find reasons to be in the garden. Nora noticed. She was fairly certain he did not know she noticed, which made it simultaneously easier to bear and considerably harder. There was something almost painful about watching a man of his particular self-possession manufacture excuses, a word with the head groundskeeper here, an inspection of the kitchen garden wall there, that placed him within conversational distance of the nursery corner, where she and Maisie spent the better part of each afternoon. On the 15th day, Maisie held up the chipped elephant toward him. The Duke went very still. He crouched, slowly, carefully, as though sudden movement might shatter something, and took the elephant from his daughter's outstretched hand. He examined it with the same grave seriousness Nora had applied to it on the first day, and something about the echo of that gesture made the air feel suddenly thin. "His ear is broken," Maisie said. 4 words, clear as struck glass. The dupe closed his eyes for just a moment, 1 breath, 2, and then opened them and looked at the elephant and said, in a voice remarkably level for a man visibly coming apart at the seams, "So it is. We shall have to see about that." Maisie retrieved the elephant, apparently satisfied, and went back to her wall. Nora looked away to give him privacy. She studied the far hedge with intense interest and gave him the full 60 seconds he needed to collect himself. When he spoke, he was beside her. He had straightened and moved without her hearing him, which was unsettling given his size. "How did you do that?" he asked, quietly. Not the Duke's voice, the man's. "I did very little," she said honestly. "I simply did not leave." He was quiet for a moment. The moor's wind moved through the garden, cold and indifferent to the fact that something between them had just shifted irrevocably. "Most people do," he said. It was not self-pity. It was a fact, stated plainly. That made it worse. Nora did not answer. There was nothing she could say that would not cost her something she was not yet prepared to spend. She found the portrait on a Thursday. She had not been looking for it. She had been searching for a thicker blanket in the corridor linen press and had opened the wrong door onto a small, cold sitting room that smelled of disuse and old candle wax. The portrait was propped against the wall, turned face inward, covered with a cloth. She should have closed the door. She lifted the cloth. The woman in the portrait was beautiful, fair-haired, serene, painted in the way of someone who has agreed to sit for a portrait rather than wished to. She looked out of the canvas with an expression that was not unhappy, but was profoundly, unmistakably alone. The late Duchess of Wrentham. Nora studied her for a long moment. Then she replaced the cloth, closed the door, and stood in the corridor until the particular cold that had settled in her had something to do with the house's poor insulation rather than her own heart. That evening, the Duke came to the nursery for the first time. He stood in the doorway while Nora read to Maisie a story about a small bear who had lost his way and found, after considerable misadventure, that home was not the place he had left, but the one he had been walking toward all along. Maisie was asleep before the ending. The Duke remained in the doorway. "She sleeps more easily," he said, a statement, not a question. "She does." Nora closed the book. "Children sleep more easily when they feel safe." And does she feel safe? Nora looked at the small, sleeping face, dark-haired and peaceful, one hand curled beneath her chin. "I believe she is beginning to," she said. She became aware, in the silence that followed, that he was no longer looking at his daughter. "Miss Fenn," he said, carefully, as though the words required handling. "Have we—" He stopped. "Your Grace?" But he shook his head once, stepped back, and was gone. Nora sat in the dim nursery for a long time afterward, her hands folded in her lap, her heart conducting itself in a manner she found entirely unacceptable. He knew something was wrong the way one knows weather before it arrives, a pressure in the atmosphere, a quality of light that had no business being there. It came to him at 3 in the morning, lying in the dark of his bedroom with the moors making their usual indifferent noise against the windows. He had been trying to remember why a woman's stillness unsettled him, the particular stillness of Miss Fenn, the way she occupied silence as though she had long practice of it, the way she sometimes paused before answering him as though selecting her words from a much larger and more dangerous collection. He had seen that stillness. Not in this woman, in a girl, 7 years ago, the summer he had spent 3 months in Dorset on his uncle's estate, before the weight of the dukedom had settled fully onto his shoulders and changed the shape of everything. A vicar's daughter, dark-haired, possessed of a directness that had disarmed him so completely he had spent the better part of that summer in a state of bewildered delight. He had written to her, after he returned to London, after his mother had sat him down and explained in her precise, bloodless way the requirements of his position and the impossibility of his attachment, he had written, once, a letter he had spent an entire night composing. She had not written back. His mother had told him, gently and with apparent sympathy, that the girl had taken the situation practically, that she was sensible, that she had wished him well and moved on without sentiment. He had believed it because it was easier than the alternative. Now, in the dark, he thought about a vicar's daughter from Dorset. He thought about the name on the reference letter he had not looked at closely enough. He thought about stillness. He was out of bed before he was fully conscious of having decided to move. The reference letter was in his desk drawer. He found it in under a minute, unfolded it, and held it to the lamp. Miss Nora Fenn, of Beer Regis, Dorset, daughter of the Reverend William Fenn. He sat down. He read it again, and then a third time, as though repetition might alter it. She had been in his house for 3 weeks. She had sat across from him in this study and told him his daughter needed someone who would simply stay, and he had looked at her face, her familiar, impossible face, and seen nothing. He had been so thoroughly armored inside his own careful composure that he had looked directly at the woman who had occupied more of his interior life than he had ever admitted to anyone, and catalogued her as staff, competent, unremarkable. He pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum. It did not help. She knew. She had known from the first moment in the entrance hall. He could see it now, the way she had gripped her bag, the way she had held his gaze for precisely 1 beat longer than a stranger would have before looking away. She had known, and she had said nothing, and she had come upstairs and been magnificent with his daughter, and said nothing, and sat across from him in the garden, and said nothing. 7 years of silence continued without interruption into his house. He was at the nursery corridor before he remembered the hour. He stopped. The house was dark and cold around him, and from behind Maisie's door came the small, even sound of a child sleeping safely. From the room beside it, the nanny's room, nothing, silence. But beneath the door, the faint line of candlelight. She was awake. He raised his hand to knock, held it there, suspended, for a very long time. He did not knock. He was not ready, and for the first time in a decade he was honest enough with himself to admit that readiness mattered, that walking through that door unprepared would do damage neither of them could afford. He went back downstairs. He did not sleep. She knew the moment she saw his face at breakfast. He had found it, the letter, or the name, or some thread she had not thought to tuck away. She could see it in the way he looked at her, not the polite, impersonal assessment of the previous weeks, but something direct and shaken, the expression of a man who has discovered overnight that the floor beneath him is a different material than he had believed. She poured Maisie's milk with a steady hand. She cut the soft bread into the shapes Maisie preferred. She did not look at him. He waited until Maisie had gone to the nursery with Mrs. Alcott before he spoke. Miss Fenn. A pause. Nora. Her name in his mouth after 7 years was a sensation she had no framework for. She set down the bread knife very carefully. Your Grace. You knew, he said, from the moment you walked in. Yes. And you said nothing. I needed the position, she said, honest, clean, unapologetic, and I had no wish to make things complicated. I intended to do my work and leave quietly when Maisie was sufficiently settled. Without telling me? You did not recognize me, she said, which answered, rather efficiently, everything I needed to know. The words landed. She watched them land. She had not meant them as a weapon. They were simply true. But the way he received them, the slight arrest of his breathing, told her they had found a mark she had not consciously aimed for. I owe you an explanation, he said. You owe me nothing, she said. It was 7 years ago. We are different people. Nora, do not. Her voice was quiet, but its edges were iron. Do not use that voice with me. Not yet. Not until I understand what happened, because I have spent 7 years believing a version of events that I am now. She stopped, drew a careful breath. Tell me about the letter. He went very still. What letter? Her blood ran cold. The letter you sent me after you left Dorset. I sent 1 letter. You did not reply. They looked at each other across the breakfast table. I never received it, she said. The silence that followed was the kind that rewrites things. She watched him understand it, watched it move through him in stages, the way a fever breaks. First the stillness, then the slow, terrible reassembly of 7 years of accepted facts into a new and damning configuration. My mother, he said. It was not a question. She came to see me, Nora said. Her voice was very even. She had not spoken of this to anyone, ever, and the words felt strange in her mouth, like objects retrieved from a great depth, waterlogged and heavy. 3 days after you left, she was perfectly civil. She told me you had thought carefully about your situation and concluded that the attachment, while genuine, was impractical, that you wished me well, that the letter you had left with her to deliver contained a small son to assist with she paused, my transition. The color had left his face entirely. I did not take the money, Nora said, and I did not read the letter. I gave it back to her, unopened, and asked her to leave. A beat. I thought it was from you. I thought you had decided I was not worth the words. Nora. Her name this time was barely sound at all. She intercepted your letter, Nora said. Not an accusation, a conclusion, arrived at slowly and at considerable cost. She told me you had been sensible about it, he said. The words came out rough, as though something was obstructing them. That you had understood the situation and wished me well, and— He stopped. He pressed both hands flat against the table surface. He looked at them. She died 4 years ago, he said. She told me nothing. She took it with her and told me nothing. Nora looked at this man, the boy she had loved made into someone heavier, more careful, lonelier, and felt the last 7 years rearrange themselves inside her, like furniture moved in a familiar room, nothing destroyed, everything in a different place. "What was in your letter?" she asked. He looked up. "I asked you to wait for me," he said. "I told you I would come back for you. I told you—" He stopped again. When he continued, his voice had the quality of something being said for the first and last time. "I told you that I had never been certain of anything in my life except you." The garden beyond the window was gray and still. Nora did not look away from him. She walked for a long time on the moors that afternoon. She needed the cold and the space and the indifferent wind, needed to be somewhere large enough to contain the thing she was carrying, because it was not simple. It would have been easier if it were simple, if 7 years of loss could be neatly exchanged for a revelation and a new beginning, the way one exchanges a worn coat for a better one. But she was not the girl who had stood in her father's parlor and handed back an unopened letter. She had been built, since then, from different materials, harder ones, more honestly made. And he, the man sitting in that house, in the devastation of what his mother had done, was not the young lord who had written those words. She sat on a flat stone above the valley and looked at the gray sky and asked herself the only question that mattered. Not whether she still felt something for him. That answer had announced itself, loudly and inconveniently, sometime around the 5th day. But whether what she felt was strong enough to bear the weight of what they would have to build. Whether she could trust not him exactly, but the version of them that might exist if she chose to stay. She was still sitting there when she heard boots on the moorland path. He was not dressed for the moors. He had clearly walked out of the house without a proper coat, which struck her as so uncharacteristic of his meticulous self-containment that she almost smiled. He stopped a few feet away. He did not sit. He stood in the wind and looked at her. "I am not here to persuade you of anything," he said. "I want you to know that. I am here because—" He paused, and in the pause she saw the effort it cost him, the dismantling of 7 years of careful emotional architecture. "I did not want you to be alone out here. That is all." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "Sit down," she said. "You look ridiculous standing in the wind without a coat." He sat. They remained there in silence, looking at the valley below, while the wind moved across the moors, and Grey Hollow Park sat in the middle distance like a house deciding, slowly, whether to open itself or stay shut. After a while, Nora said, "I am not the same person I was." "No," he agreed, "neither am I." "Whatever this is," she said carefully, "it cannot be a resumption. It would have to be something new." "Yes," he said, simply, without qualification. She nodded once. She did not take his hand. It was too soon for that, and they had both learned, expensively, the cost of moving too fast. But she did not move away from the warmth of him beside her on the cold stone. That, for now, was its own kind of answer. The letter arrived on a Tuesday from his cousin, Lord Harwick, a man Nora had never met, but whose name she had heard once, 7 years ago, as the person who had pressed the dukedom's matrimonial expectations most urgently upon the duke's mother. It was addressed to the duke. She was not meant to see it. She saw it because Mrs. Alcott, flustered with a kitchen emergency, left it on the nursery side table by mistake, and because its seal was already broken, and because the first line was visible before she had registered she was reading it at all. "I understand you have installed a vicar's daughter from Dorset in the house. I trust you are not being sentimental." She set it face down. She went to find Mrs. Alcott. She did not tell the Duke. But he found her that evening in the library, their library now, she had begun to think of it that way, which was its own species of recklessness. And he had already read it. She could tell by the particular quality of his stillness, the stillness she now recognized, not as coldness, but as a man managing something large in a small interior space. "He will make trouble," he said. "I know. He has connections to 3 members of the House of Lords and a great enthusiasm for other people's business." He looked at her directly. "He will not be the only one." "I know that, too," she said. "I need you to understand what you would be walking into." Nora closed the book in her lap. "Cornelius," she said, his given name, used for the first time, landing between them with quiet significance. "I walked into a house where I knew the master had once broken my heart because I needed the work, and I am not a person who retreats from difficult things. I have been on the moors in a November wind and did not leave. I have been on this estate for 4 weeks, during which my history with you has become known below stairs. Yes, I am aware, and I am still here." She held his gaze. "I am not fragile. Do not manage me." He was quiet for a long moment. "What I was going to say," he said, with the ghost of something warm in his voice, "is that I intend to write to my solicitor tomorrow, and that I would like, very much, for you to still be here when I do." Nora looked at him. "I will think about it," she said, and then, because she was not the girl who hid things anymore, "I have already decided. I simply enjoy watching you be uncertain." He laughed, a real one, unguarded, the laugh of the young man she had known surfacing briefly inside the Duke, and the sound of it in the quiet library was the most beautiful thing she had heard in 7 years. The wedding was small. Not because of shame, she had been precise about that, and he had understood without needing it explained twice, but because neither of them had any interest in performance. The people present were people who wished them well and had earned the right to be there. Mrs. Alcott wept with great dignity into a handkerchief. The head groundskeeper shook the Duke's hand for considerably longer than was strictly necessary. Maisie wore her best dress and held the chipped elephant throughout the ceremony. At the point where the vicar asked if anyone present knew of any impediment, Nora felt the Duke's hand tighten over hers, not from nerves, she understood, but from the particular ferocity of a man who had lost something once and was not remotely prepared to lose it again. No one spoke. Lord Harwick had sent a letter of tepid congratulations from London, which the Duke had read aloud at breakfast in a voice of such perfect neutrality that Nora had been obliged to hide her expression behind her teacup. Society would adjust. Society always did. It simply required time and a sufficiently untroubled target, and the Duke of Wrentham had discovered, to his own mild surprise, that he no longer particularly cared to be a target of any kind. After the ceremony, while the small gathering moved inside for the breakfast, Nora stood for a moment alone in the garden. The pear tree was in blossom, the lavender beds were coming in. Somewhere above her, the nursery window was open, and she could hear Maisie's voice, clear and uninterrupted now, a steady, ongoing narration of the chipped elephant's daily adventures. She thought about a girl who had handed back an unopened letter. She thought about everything that letter had cost them both, and everything that cost had, obliquely and painfully and at considerable length, eventually made possible. She was not grateful for the loss. She would not dress it up as necessary. But she was here, and the lavender was coming in, and inside the house the man she had loved at 19 and chosen again at 26 was waiting for her at his own breakfast table. She went in. 2 years later, Maisie Carew could not be made to stop talking. This was the universal opinion of everyone at Grey Hollow Park, expressed with varying degrees of affection and exhaustion. She narrated meals. She provided commentary on the weather. She had developed specific and well-defended opinions about which of the kitchen garden's varieties of apple was superior, and communicated these opinions at length to anyone who stood still long enough to become an audience. The chipped elephant still lived on her window-sill. Nora had suggested gently that a craftsman might be able to restore the ear. Maisie had considered this for a full day and then declined. Some things, she explained with the solemn authority of a 7-year-old, were better with their damage showing. Nora had looked at her husband over the child's head when she said that, and found him already looking at her. The library had become theirs in every sense. Books moved, rearranged, acquired, argued over. On winter evenings, when Maisie was asleep and the moors were doing their indifferent best against the windows, they sat in the chairs that had migrated, over the course of 2 years, from opposite sides of the fireplace to beside each other, facing the same direction. He still carried his silences with him. She did not ask him to put them down, only to let her sit inside them, which he did, with a willingness that had taken time to develop and now appeared permanent. She had written to her father when they married. He had written back, a long letter, warm and careful, the letter of a man who had watched his daughter carry something alone for 7 years and was deeply relieved to hear she had set it down. She kept the letter in the desk drawer in the library. Beside it, in an envelope she had not opened until 6 months after the wedding, when she was ready, the original letter. 7 years late, folded still in its original creases, the ink slightly faded. I told you that I had never been certain of anything in my life except you. She had read it once. She did not need to read it again. She knew what it said. She was living in the answer. If you enjoyed this story, if you felt every stolen glance, every 7-year silence, every moment these two people found their way back to each other, then you are exactly who this channel was made for. We are here every day with stories that reach into your chest and remind you what it feels like to feel something real. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss one, and drop a comment below. Tell us the moment that got you. Was it Maisie and the elephant? The letter? That laugh in the library? We read every single comment, every one. The next story is already written, and you are not prepared for what is coming.